The last fare. This story was shared with me by an old taxi driver I met a few years ago, a man named Tom. I remember it vividly, as if it happened just yesterday, his voice trembling, eyes darting around as though making sure no one else could hear us. We were in a small diner, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and the constant scent of burnt coffee in the air. It was the kind of place that makes stories like this seem more believable, as if the very walls had absorbed years of untold secrets. Tom was an unassuming man, a little rough around the edges, with deep lines etched across his face and hair more gray than black. He told me he'd been a taxi driver for nearly 20 years, a job he used to love. He enjoyed the freedom, the way the city seemed different at night, and the people he'd meet from all walks of life. Driving a cab is more than just picking people up and dropping them off, he said, pausing to take a shaky drag from his cigarette. You see the world in a way no one else does, like a night watchman over the city. His eyes grew distant as he spoke, staring past the diner walls at something only he could see. But then his expression darkened. Everything changed after one particular night. The night, he said, that made him hang up his keys for good. I could still see the fear in his eyes as he recounted the events, his hands trembling slightly as he cradled his coffee mug. He had never shared the story with anyone, not his family, not his friends, but he needed someone to know, as if telling it might help him make sense of it. It started out like any other shift, he said, nothing out of the ordinary. He had no idea that night would haunt him forever, and then he began to tell the tale. I'd been driving a taxi for nearly 20 years, and you get used to the odd ones. People too drunk to remember where they live, late night lovers sneaking around, even the occasional celebrity avoiding the paparazzi. But that night was different. It was a Wednesday, and the city was quiet. The kind of quiet that seeps into your bones and makes you feel like you're the only soul awake in the world. It was close to 2 a.m., and I had just dropped off a fare downtown. I was thinking about calling it a night, maybe grabbing a coffee before heading home, when the dispatcher crackled through the radio, an address out in the old part of town. I hesitated. It was out of the way, and there wasn't much out there but abandoned warehouses and a few rundown houses. But a fare's a fare, and I figured it'd be quick. I radioed back, accepted the job, and made my way over. The street was deserted, dimly lit by a single flickering streetlight. I pulled up to the address, a crumbling old building that looked like it hadn't seen life in decades. I almost thought it was the wrong place until I saw her, a woman standing just outside the building, her face hidden by the hood of her coat. She was tall, slim, and something about the way she stood, perfectly still, almost like a statue, made me uneasy. I rolled down the window and called out, "You call for a taxi?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she just nodded and slowly made her way to the back door. She got in, and a chill filled the cab, colder than the night air. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror, but all I could see was the shadow of her hood, her face obscured in darkness. Her hands were pale, resting in her lap, fingers slightly curled as if holding something invisible. "Where to?" I asked, my voice coming out shakier than I intended. There was a pause before she replied, "Just drive." I frowned, glancing back at her. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, and it had this strange echoing quality to it, like she was speaking from far away. "I need a destination," I said, trying to sound calm. "Drive," she repeated, her head tilting slightly, her hood shifting just enough for me to glimpse her mouth, a thin, pale line that barely moved. Against my better judgment, I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. I figured I'd drive a block or two, and if she didn't give me an address, I'd tell her I had to stop. But as I started driving, a strange feeling settled over me. The street seemed emptier than before, the city lights growing dimmer, as if the world outside the cab was fading away. We drove in silence, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional rattle as the cab hit potholes. I tried to make small talk, asking if she lived around here, where she was headed, but she didn't answer. She just sat there, face hidden, hands unmoving. After a few minutes, I started feeling wrong. My head felt heavy, my vision blurred at the edges. I shook my head, trying to clear it, when I realized the street we were on didn't look familiar. I'd been driving this city for years, and I knew every road, every turn, but I had no idea where we were. The buildings were old, run down, their windows dark and empty. There were no street signs, no other cars, not even a single light. Panic started to rise in my chest. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and my heart skipped a beat. She was staring at me now, her hood pushed back just enough for me to see her eyes, dark, hollow, like two empty sockets. I slammed on the brakes, the cab skidding to a stop. My hands shook as I turned around, my voice barely a whisper. "Get out," I said. "Get out of my car." She didn't move, she just stared, her mouth curving into the slightest hint of a smile. And then she spoke, her voice echoing through the cab, louder than before. "You shouldn't have picked me up." A cold shiver ran down my spine, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I fumbled for the door handle, throwing it open and stumbling out of the cab. I backed away, my eyes never leaving the back seat, but when I looked again, she was gone. The cab was empty. I stood there in the middle of the deserted street, breath coming in ragged gasps, my mind racing. I didn't know where I was, how I'd gotten there, or where she had gone. The street was silent, the buildings looming like dark sentinels. I got back in the cab, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel, and I drove. I didn't care where. I just needed to get away from that place. The minutes turned into hours as I drove aimlessly, searching for any familiar landmark. The street seemed endless, a twisting maze. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see her face again, those dark, hollow eyes staring at me. But there was nothing, just the empty back seat, the darkened streets beyond. Eventually, I found myself on the edge of town, the old warehouses giving way to newer buildings, the lights of the city coming back into view. Relief washed over me, and I pulled over, my body shaking as I finally exhaled the breath I'd been holding. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel, trying to make sense of what had happened. I must have sat there for a while, the cab idling quietly, when I heard it again, a soft tap on the window. My head snapped up, eyes wide, heart pounding. There she was, standing on the sidewalk, her hood pulled low over her face, her hands pressed against the glass. "Let me in," she whispered, her voice muffled but clear. I screamed. I threw the car into gear, tires squealing as I sped away, breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My eyes were glued to the road ahead, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The cab felt colder, the air pressing in around me, and I knew she was there, even if I couldn't see her. I drove straight through the city, out to the countryside, empty fields stretching out on either side, the road winding endlessly ahead. I kept driving until the sun started to rise, the sky turning from black to a deep blue. Only then did I pull over, exhaustion finally catching up to me. I stepped out of the cab, the morning air biting against my skin. I looked back through the window, half expecting to see her sitting there, but the back seat was empty. I opened the door, heart pounding as I searched every inch of the cab. Nothing. She was gone. I sank to the ground, back against the car, breath coming in shaky gasps. I knew I couldn't go back to driving. Not after that. I called a friend to pick me up, and I left the cab right where it was, engine still running. I never looked back. Now, years later, I still can't explain what happened that night. Some people say it was a ghost, a spirit wandering the streets looking for someone to take her away. Others say it was all in my head, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the shadows grow long, I still hear it. A soft tap on the window, a whisper asking to be let in. And I wonder if someday she'll find me again.